Elder Scrolls lore. It's a vast sea of knowledge whose depths are nigh unknowable in fullness. We have made hundreds of lore videos throughout the years and discussed it endlessly. I remember playing Oblivion for the first time at age 11 with zero idea of how much of the world I did not understand. Regardless, at the time I had the most fun with a game I had ever had in my life at that point. I remember reading the back. Live another life in another world. Create and play any character you can imagine, from the noble warrior to the sinister assassin. Birthday money gone, Oblivion acquired, life changed. It's one of the great appeals of the Elder Scrolls. On the surface, it's a fantasy world with all the broadly familiar touchstones that casual players can easily recognize: orcs, elves, mages and the like. Yet also, if it tickles your fancy, and you are intrigued by the ramblings of a madman, the theories of a mage, or the sermons of a priest, then in-game you can research and investigate their concepts by reading books, speaking with characters, and putting together environmental evidences to construct a new worldview. There are endless rabbit holes to wander down, so much information, answers to questions you haven't even asked yet. But one of the best things about such lore is the uncertainties, the spaces between, the countless theories. However, on this journey of discovery, there are some common pitfalls that can lead to a lot of wasted time and unsubstantiated thinking. Welcome to Fudge Muppet, my name is Scott, and today I bring you 3 big misconceptions about Elder Scrolls lore with the aim of equipping you with a key framework in your approach to understanding said lore. First things first, the most intimidating and incredibly interpretable component of the Elder Scrolls lore, and I'm talking about metaphysics, the abstract concepts, the fringe pieces of information that have little to no impact on your enjoyment of the game. However, they are incredibly entertaining to talk about. Source: me, who talks about the Elder Scrolls lore for a living. You will have surely heard a few of these truly intellectual ideas. Dragon breaks, Shezarines, Kim, Godhead, mantling, the wheel, the towers, Amaranth, so on and so forth. These notions have become much talked about in the lore community for decades now, and certain perceptions have been assumed as truth or established fact. But many of these claims are either completely untenable or built upon assumptions, and I want to show you several examples of how fragile these theories can be and how scarce the evidence actually is for some of these concepts. Let's start with Kim as an example, the idea that one can achieve a form of apotheosis or transcendence that allows them to escape the constraints of reality and realize the truth of the Godhead. Kim is a state likened to a dreamer suddenly gaining lucidity and awareness of the dream. This concept is talked about lots in the lore community, and the writings of former developer Michael Kirkbride are given consideration. But the facts are, from in-game sources, there are only 2 direct mentions of Kim as the concept, both associated with kingship, one which claims those who know of it can reshape the land. But any further explanation ultimately requires the out-of-game sources from Michael Kirkbride that expound upon the concept. This is not to say it's not a valuable or at the very least fun idea when discussing Elder Scrolls lore, but in the spirit of first principle thinking, don't take everything said online about Kim as total truth. You may have heard of the Shezarine, an avatar of Shazar, which is the Cyrodiilic equivalent of the Nordic Shore or Aldmeri Lorkhan. You may have seen speculation that even the last Dragonborn, the player character of Skyrim, is a Shezarine. Well, you may be further surprised that the term Shezarine is found one single time in all of the Elder Scrolls lore available. It is in Volume 5 of the Songs of Pelennor. It is a solid truth that Morahouse was the son of Kine, but whether or not Pelennor was indeed the Shezarine is best left unsaid, for once Plontinu, who favoured the short sword, said it, and that night he was smothered by moths. That's it. Now, the label Shezarine is often used by the lore community to describe the vague mythological concept of the missing god returning in the form of a mortal time and time again. Several myths from different cultures can be related to the idea of the Shezarine. These disparate quotes can be strung together as implied evidence for the concept of the missing god, whatever name he may go by, returning to walk known, yet none is explicit, nor are any of the mechanics spelled out. You may have heard that Hjalti Earlybeard, Wulfarth, and Zurin Arctus were all Shezarines that became the Talos Oversoul, a theory I discussed briefly in the recent Missing God video, which I will link below. But from what I can glean, the evidence is either based heavily on out-of-game statements by Michael Kirkbride or by association with the title Izmir. This is not me dismissing the theory as false, it's certainly possible, but you must be careful to only build upon the in-game sources for a theory that is broadly applicable and convincing to everyone. Another great example is the Dragon Break. A Dragon Break is named so because Akatosh the dragon is a god of time, and when the dragon breaks, time breaks, and so this is referring to a period where time is distorted and several contradictory time threads split, and when the Dragon Break is over, the timeline is fixed linear once more. However, the past is now muddled with paradoxical events. This idea was conceived in Morrowind's development in order to deal with the multiple endings of Daggerfall. In this instance, known as the Warp of the West or the Miracle of Peace, the Numidium's activation resulted in the many feuding kingdoms of Iliac Bay to become 4 strong and peaceful kingdoms. It is also said that when Tiber Septim used the Numidium in his conquests, he also caused a dragon break then. Another of the dragon breaks spoken about in-game is the infamous Middle Dawn, where a dragon break is said to have occurred due to the meddling of the Marakati selectives. These 3 instances of a dragon break are the ones that have in-game sources that claim this explicitly, and there are some allusions to or statements that imply the Battle of Red Mountain is also one, yet I wouldn't count that as confirmed. However, you may see the term dragon break thrown around endlessly, trying to lazily explain or justify any and all contradictions within the lore, which can often be attributed to different or biased perspectives recounting those events. In short, this misconception can be summarized as metaphysical certainty, of which there essentially is none in the Elder Scrolls lore. We constantly rely on the myths and perspectives of cultures and individuals combined with some in-game experiences to give us an idea of how the world works, but a good chunk, if not most of the Elder Scrolls metaphysics are working theories rather than settled matters of fantasy world physics. Which brings me to misconception number 2, that anything in the Elder Scrolls can be taken as 100% truth. Every single thing written in a book, said to you in person, all the lore is subject to the unreliable narrator. Some fictional universes have truths that firmly lay out the functions of the universe, but with the Elder Scrolls, this is not the case. Let's take a look at an example related to the former point. The Towers concept is a metaphysical understanding of the Orbis, the Elder Scrolls universe, as a wheel with 8 spokes, each represented by 8 towers that supposedly prevent the fabric of reality from destabilizing. Towers such as adamantine, white gold, and crystal-like lore. This is also heavily connected to the theory of the Thalmor conspiracy to unmake the world by disabling all the towers. It's a very cool and entertaining theory, but there are many valid criticisms and dismissals of this when you consider the basis for a lot of the claims. For starters, the original framework for the universe as a wheel is based upon the 36 lessons of Vivek, the religious sermons of a known liar who would never let the facts get in the way of a good story. We also have to consider that other theories of the metaphysical structure of the universe may also be entirely valid. Perhaps the ancient Khajiit are instead correct, with the lunar lattice as the principal boundaries of Mundus, or perhaps instead it is something more like the Yakutans claim, in that we're all living on a skin ball of dead world skins. The unreliable narrator aspect becomes far clearer when you understand that the most highbrow concepts of the Elder Scrolls come from the myths and religious teachings of different cultures. Take a much simpler example. Look at Aedra and Daedra. These definitions are Elven in origin, and they really only make sense in the context of their belief. That is, the elves believe they were descended from gods. So Aedra translates to ancestors, and Daedra translates to not our ancestors. The gods who took part in creation and those that did not and conserved their powers. Because this is one of the earliest frameworks, and Elven faith has been either dominant or influenced the mainstream religions of today, like the 8 divines of the imperial cult, ultimately it has become the lens through which we see any god. And honestly, the distinction of Daedra really seems to identify with something along the lines of a being from oblivion. Statements such as Daedra cannot create, only corrupt or change are also repeated and taken as total confirmation. However, there are plenty of reasons to take this with a grain of salt. Consider firstly that this is a cultural perspective, as said in the quote, for example, in Blackmarsh they do not agree with that assessment of the Daedra, but secondly, and more importantly, consider that the Aedra-Daedra distinction is not shared by all cultures. Consider the Khajiit, who simply regard all gods as spirits and divide their gods based on other characteristics. For example, the sky spirits include Azura, Joan, Jode, Kanathi, and Magris, or the worldly spirits including the likes of Nerni, Hamora, Hircine, Sengen, and Ifa. These groupings are mixes of what would be traditionally considered Aedra or Daedra, yet Azura creates the Khajiit and Moonsugar despite her status as a Daedra. But if that does not count because she made cat people from pre-existing stock or sugar from light, then I do not know what the difference between creation and change is. Where do you draw the line? Creativity is an iterative process. The result is always made out of something that existed prior. A chair may be made from a tree, or this device you are watching this video on may be made from hundreds of rare metal components from all over the world. Both examples are things created from pre-existing forms, but I would still consider this a creation, not just change. Simply put, I can't find a good definition that distinguishes this concept of change versus creation. Everything in the universe is an iteration of something previous, even if well hidden. Hell, if the mythic Dawn are right and Mundus is just the Daedric princedom of Lorkhan usurped, then the whole concept of Aedra versus Daedra gets tossed out the window. Anyways, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. I'm principally trying to get across the idea that you must take the unreliable narrator into account when interpreting Elder Scrolls lore, and you must consider that everything you read is an in-universe perspective, not an authoritative source. Also, this perspective makes it way more fun because you will explore many more uncertainties and different worldviews because of this. But if the unreliable narrator wasn't enough, then consider retcons and game consistency problems. The Elder Scrolls as a video game franchise is 29 years old. In that time, there have been 5 mainline Elder Scrolls games: Arena, Daggerfall, Morrowind, Oblivion, Skyrim, and the Elder Scrolls Online with its many ongoing expansions and DLCs. Throughout all these iterations, things have changed a lot. The Elder Scrolls lore is not consistent. Consider even the feel of the 90s Arena and Daggerfall, which were much closer to that classic D&D with a retro Frank Frazetta, Clyde Coldwell-esque fantasy aesthetic, compared to Morrowind's thematic overhaul with visual inspirations from Dark Crystal, Star Wars, and even Mad Max, compared to Oblivion's Peter Jackson paint to the Skyrim we know now. With changes in developers, writers, creative direction, and theme, it is understandable that the lore has had to shift and mold to the visions of future games. The biggest example that most of you would be easily familiar with is the concept of the Dragonborn. In Skyrim, you are the dragon soul-sucking demigod, a virtuoso of the Thum, the dragon language. This lore was all new to 2011's Skyrim. Prior to this edition, the Thum was completely divorced from dragons, and the concept of what a Dragonborn is was different. In Oblivion, the concept of Dragonborn was solely to do with the covenant between Alesia and Akatosh and the divine right of kings, or even look to examples like the Draga that featured in the Blood Moon expansion for the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind, which took place on the Isle of Solstheim, and it is said that they were the cursed undead who resorted to cannibalism, a crime against nature. Obviously, later this was changed so that they were the reanimated followers of the Dragon Priests, like on the rest of Skyrim. Some retcons are good, some are less good, but when analysing the lore, it's always important to understand which game the evidence is sourced from. Sometimes, like in the case of the Dragonborn, it can retroactively fit in well enough. The Dragonborn emperors didn't run around shouting and killing dragons because there were no dragons, nor was the Thum necessarily taught. When reading the lore, always keep this in mind. For example, you may have famously heard that Cyrodiil was once a jungle, and this was because in the Redguard Morrowind era of the Elder Scrolls, Cyrodiil was understood as a jungled province of rice paddies and river systems and thousands of cults on a Venice-like expansive lake city, essentially a far more exotic description than we experience in the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. This change is explained first in the Mythic Dawn commentaries. Kim, those who know it can reshape the land. Witness the home of the Red King once jungled. In reality, this was just a thematic change for Bethesda's vision, but in the lore, that is how it can be interpreted. Tiber Septim achieving Kim, becoming Talos, and changing Cyrodiil into a fertile heartland. Bethesda doubles down on this in Skyrim, with the NPC Heimskir in Whiterun shouting his sermons.
But you were once man, aye, and as man you said, "Let me show you the power of Talos Stormcrown, born of the north, where my breath is long winter. I breathe now in royalty and reshape this land which is mine. I do this for you, Red Legions, for I love you!"
But by the time of the Elder Scrolls Online, we get a bit of a problem. Cyrodiil in the Second Era, before Tiber Septim, should have been shown as a jungle, but it wasn't, and so there have been a whole host of copes to deal with this. Firstly, from what I understand, people began to expand on the already established concept of Kim by saying that it allowed Talos to retroactively make Cyrodiil a fertile heartland throughout all time. Then there was the infamous transcription error argument made by an in-game scholar, Phrastus of Elenhir, which essentially claims Cyrodiil was never a jungle and it was just a translation error. However, in the Elder Scrolls Online, there is also the writings of Lady Cinnabar, which say that Phrastus is an idiot and that the metaphysical properties of the towers, such as the White Gold Tower, shape the environment according to their rulers, so that when the Needs overthrew the Aelids, it turned from jungle to temperate fields and woods. Copium for days. Anyways, the point is, knowing what game the lore is from allows you to understand the assumptions about the rest of the world at that time, and you should take it into consideration when trying to understand the inconsistencies. To summarize concisely, the Elder Scrolls lore is the product of 29 years, many games, many contributors in the form of writers and developers, and so when approaching this large corpus of lore, you should come equipped with these 3 frameworks to avoid pitfalls in your learning. 1. The metaphysics are not definitively established, and many highbrow concepts are based on shaky grounds and so should be taken with salt to taste. 2. The unreliable narrator applies to everything. It is acceptable to question some of the most fundamental bases and distinctions, such as what Aedra and Daedra really constitute. 3. The lore is not consistent. The games have changed in vision and theme many times. Always consider the game of origin when looking at the lore as to help understand the context. With those 3 key points, I think you should have a much easier time at analyzing the lore, understanding the context in which it was written, and coming up with your own conclusions from that. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this helpful. Like the video, subscribe for more Elder Scrolls content like this. My name is Scott from Fudge Muppet. Thanks again, and I'll be back to nerd out with you again next time.